both for the people, for the politics, for the army, but especially for the writers and for the artists. So there are many different ways in which artists participate according to what the tasks of the revolution or the repression or the transition may be. But these are not always the same sort of thing that you do. In other words, I can't write Death in the Maiden when I'm with Allende's, because people aren't being tortured there, right? So I wrote it for the transition. So I think that one of the interesting things that we have to understand is that there is not one voice only coming out of this, only one way in which you react to this, but that writers especially and artists react in different ways and have different tasks, often simultaneously, during these periods of repression, of transition, of revolution. And
Ariel, I know that you know, writers and intellectuals, and it's that sort of element of society that's often preemptively targeted by authoritarian regimes when they come into power. They seem to go straight for them in the first instance. What do you think is the immediate threat?
Well, the immediate threat is that if you allow anybody to speak out, if you allow anybody, I mean, the one thing that art has, especially in countries such as Egypt, Libya, Chile, is that it's always transgressive. Even when it's a love poem, it's transgressive, because you're expressing truth. And these are regimes that are based upon lies. They're based upon hiding from each other and from the people the truth of what's happening. So because artists tend to, I think what artists always do and writers always do is, in some sense, in the joy of our own writing and the expression, we are calling into being the society of freedom and of communication, some sort of a utopian society that will be in the future. So we are really very, very dangerous. We're dangerous as symbols. We're dangerous as expressive voices.
Hisham Atta, let me ask you, you had personal experience of living, you know, with the secret police and living under the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. Give us some idea of what you really experienced in terms of how repressive it was.
Well, you mean my family. Personal experience, or you mean
yourself
family experience?
Yourself and your family,
it was, of course, yeah, well, we left Libya in the late 70s when, I mean, if you were to choose, you know, one of the important years under the Gaddafi regime, it was 79, because many writers were imprisoned then. It was a great crackdown on civil society, books were burnt. We left that year and we went to Egypt, and it wasn't until 10 years later that my father was kidnapped. And during those 10 years, we were sort of sandwiched between two dictatorships, between the Egyptian and the Libyan. And so we had security guards supposed to be guarding us, but actually, as it turns out, they were sort of monitoring us, Egyptian security guards. And in the end, it was actually the Egyptian Secret Service that handed my father over to Libya. But I mean, this is a particular story. This is our particular story. I don't think it's as relevant right now, or as interesting right now as general life in Libya. I mean, there are people that went through much worse things than that.
Let me,
you know, summary execution and disappearances under Gaddafi were you know, a very common thing.
Let me bring in a caller we've got on the line from Virginia. Oliver, thanks for being with us. What would you like to ask?
Thank you, Riz. I have a couple questions. The first one is the substance of the word that activate these demonstrations, or the repetition? Because from history, we learned that the German people went with Adolf Hitler, despite all the atrocities that he did, to the end, until the end. So that's my question: is the repetition or the substance? And the second question is, if these autocratic regimes in the Middle East and Northern Africa start collapsing one after another, is this going to affect the intelligence sharing between the Western intelligence agencies and their intelligence agencies? Is going to affect the war on terror negatively?
Interesting, okay. Well, Oliver, let me put the first part to Ariel Dorfman and ask about that. Is it the repetition of the phrase or the actual content that allows someone to be so convincing when it comes to using words?
Well, you know, I think that the use of those words by these totalitarian regimes is not only in the incantation of the word itself, but it has to do with the fertile ground where it happens. There is, for instance, a great deal of desire for security and stability, and that's what dictators play to all the time. They always play with fear. So I don't think it's only the repetition of the words. What's nice about art is that art doesn't repeat words. It invents words constantly. It's always imagining a different parallel reality. And that's where its enormous strength comes from. And that's where I think also we have this, this tremendous pressure on artists. That's why artists are always exiled. They're jailed, as many other people are. I mean, our Libyan friend certainly explained that very, very clearly. Very often artists, in fact, they're persecuted, but very often at least we know about their fate. We don't know about the fate about the peasants and the workers and the students. They're just thrown away and neglected and forgotten. And very often the writer becomes the person who can write about that, can tell those stories. We're really storytellers, and I think all three of us have lived that experience of the extraordinary strength of the story that is told. And that story is told, either it's told or retold. And that is a repetition, which is much stronger than the incantation, the enchantment of a Hitler or of a Gaddafi.
Well, Ahdas Suef, let me ask you to take the second part of Oliver's question, the issue of whether or not you think there might be a better or worse cooperation between the East and the West now that we're seeing the change in the Arab regimes, especially when it comes to the so-called war on terror.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is unpackage the question. He uses the terms the war on terror, and then he talks about intelligence sharing. So first of all, what is exactly this war on terror? I think that's a big question, and everybody would agree on that. And then intelligence sharing. Now, if we look at an aspect of the cooperation between Egypt and the West, specifically the United States, in the so-called war on terror, we come up with extraordinary rendition. So basically, Egypt, becoming a place of choice for prisoners flown over from the United States to be tortured. I would hope that these practices would completely end. And I think that this is a large part of what the Egyptian people want, that their country should stop being used to implement strategies and to implement policies that are inimical to the region, to the country, and to our moral and social well-being. Because of course, if you become a center for torture at the behest of the United States, then the filter down effect means that torture becomes endemic and systemic in society, which is what we have experienced. And so I think this whole thing of cooperation in the war on terror is going to need to be rethought.
Well, Hadaf, I want to put to you a couple of emails that we got, your impression or comments made by a couple of emails that we received. I'm going to read them back to you. The first one's from a viewer by the name of Hazan Baloch, who says, the words of writers and poets act as a mirror to their societies. They are bound to write on the problems of society to free people from stagnation. And the second email comes from the USA, from Ahmed Abdullah in Nebraska, who says, in the colonial era, poets and intellectuals inspired people to liberate their countries from oppression. No revolution can truly succeed without the intellectual elite. Now, I wonder, do you think it's that power of inspiration, Hadaf, that threatens oppressive regimes?
Well, I think that I think different arts, or even different literary arts, have different functions, and it's much easier to see the function of poetry in revolution and in rousing revolutions than it is, for example, to see fiction. But what fiction does as well, I think, is it keeps certain ideas alive, and it therefore keeps the ground fertile for